This is section 9, lecture 3. In this section, we're going to be talking about global trade and monetary relations as an aspect of our foreign policy. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. Both of these organizations were ones that were in part founded through the large efforts of the United States and continue based on the ideals that our politicians espouse for the structure of the global economy. The current international financial system, trading system, monetary system, and even to an extent our foreign aid systems are based on the Bretton Woods Agreement, or what is called the Bretton Woods system. This was a meeting at the end of World War II, primarily guided by the United States and the United Kingdom, to determine what the post-war world would look like. And in driving the creation of these organizations, and thus the structure of the current international financial system, these ideas we see reflect U.S. Ideologies of capitalism and free trade. Now, these are based on the theories we discussed in the earlier lecture regarding classical economic liberalism. Two key classical economic liberals were Adam Smith in his book Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, where he argues that there should be less government intervention in economies that would lead to greater efficiency and greater economic growth. And David Ricardo, who discussed the theory of comparative advantage and how nation states should act in this free trade system. And so these organizations and the current structure of the international economy is based on the driving ideology and desires of the United States from the post-World War II era really through today. It still remains the driving ideology. And so the focus is on open trade and open markets and lowering barriers to trade. We'll talk about barriers to trade in the subsequent lecture. And this ideology has terminology associated with it called the Washington Consensus. Out of the creation of the Bretton Woods Agreement, we have these 5 fundamental policies: the formation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, fixed yet adjustable exchange rate systems. Initially, the exchange rate system was fixed. Everyone's currency in the world was fixed to the value of the US dollar, and the US dollar was fixed to the value of gold. But in the early 1970s, during the Nixon administration, the United States was taken off the gold standard, and now exchange rates fluctuate based on the supply and the demand of the currency itself, which is largely based on the value of that nation state's economy. Currencies were required to be converted for trade, and this is largely what the International Monetary Fund was formed to do, to allow a centralized system in which trade was easier to achieve through currency conversion and also through currency reserves. In order to make trade easier, nation states would buy into the International Monetary Fund, and so when they get into a trade imbalance. That is, if they owe countries other money, they don't necessarily have to wait for the money itself. They can borrow based on their buy-in to the International Monetary Fund. This keeps the trading regime moving and moving in sort of a smoother fashion. Exchange rates could be changed, and all members were required to subscribe to the IMF's capital. That has to do with 0.3 currency conversion. And so really what the Bretton Woods system is about creating this system in which international trade was easier to achieve and international exchange was easier to achieve. Once again, the ideology behind this is that of capitalism being driven by United States and the United Kingdom primarily. These agreements also include the formation of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it subsequently became the World Trade Organization. And so then, this system is based on gaining more trade among nation states and lowering the barriers to trade between nation states. And so then, the United States, as part of its foreign policy, was very influential in creating the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the World Trade Organization, which it became in 1995, and continues to be supportive of these institutions, the World Trade Organization, and driving fundamental principles towards freer trade. That is, freezing tariffs, taxes on goods and services. Well, if taxes exist on goods and services coming in from outside of your country, you're less likely to buy them. And so in order to encourage more trade, those tariffs have to be lowered, reduced, so on and so forth. All of this has to do with that ideology of capitalism that we discussed in the earlier lecture. And so the United States has and does continue to engage in free trade agreements. This is a slide that you saw in an earlier lecture, but it's worth showing once again. This free trade ideology is based on the ideas of capitalism, driven by our politicians, and the biggest free trade agreements that we're involved in are the North American Free Trade Agreement, that is NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We also have a Dominican Republic, Central America, United States Free Trade Agreement. We're currently negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would be another free trade agreement. But then we also have bilateral free trade agreements with any number of nation states listed below. One of the things that we see in our politics, and one of the things that we see in the politics of all nation states, is that this idea of free trade, even though it has been the driving factor behind our economic policies for the last 60 to 70 years, it's been the driving factor behind our economic statecraft, our economic foreign policies for the last 60 to 70 years, is that nation states don't always want to open up to free trade. And usually that has to do with domestic politics. And so domestic politics and politicians are worried about domestic industries, our economy, not the economies of other nation states, and domestic employment, our nation states' citizens having jobs. And of course, they might be concerned about themselves as well, those domestic politicians, because if the domestic economy is hurting. If there aren't enough jobs, of course, in a democracy, that's going to come back on them in the guise of voting them out of office. And so, historically, the United States and all other nation states too have had times at which we try to protect our industries, protect our economy from this idea of free trade. And we have done so through any number of means. Tariffs were the historical way that you would protect your domestic economy. And a tariff is a tax on imports, which raises the prices on foreign goods, and thus makes the domestically made good more competitive. You're more likely to buy a domestically made good rather than a foreign one because the foreign one's more expensive. Well, our agreements in the World Trade Organization and other free trade organizations have sought to reduce tariffs. Tariffs still exist, but they have been lowered greatly throughout the past 60 to 70 years. And in those free trade areas, tariffs do not exist. Another protectionist policy is a quota. And a quota is a numerical limit on the flow of goods between nation states. And so by saying only 1,000 of a particular good can come into the United States, that allows then the domestically made good, that it is its competitor, to sell more. So you're just keeping the domestically made goods competitive because those numbers of foreign goods have been met. Another key area where the United States particularly, but all of the nation states too, has sought to protect our domestic economy is through subsidies. And this is money given to industries, and particularly in the United States, given to agriculture to keep them competitive until they are economically competitive or efficient with the globally produced goods. And so then, in order to keep our industries open and competitive with maybe lower price goods from abroad, in order to keep our agricultural sector competitive with the cheap labor from abroad, our government subsidizes this aspect of our economy. One of the biggest areas where we see the United States act to protect our domestic industries and our domestic economy are non-tariff barriers. These are regulations placed on goods coming from outside the country based on quality or based on a required inspection process that will prohibit efficient trade because of higher quality, health, or safety standards. And so, for instance, we argue that if you are importing toothpaste or dog food or whatever from another country, it has to meet the health and safety standards of the United States. Well, one of the reasons that this protects domestic industries is because those foreign goods are cheaper, not just because of cheaper labor or comparative advantage. Oftentimes we see foreign goods as cheaper because they use lower quality production. And there was a rash of these health and safety standard issues in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, 2007, and 2008, where a lot of goods from China were kept from being imported into the United States based on health and safety standards. The toothpaste that I mentioned, the dog food that I mentioned, drywall was one of them, lead paint on children's toys, so on and so forth. Another non-tariff barrier is government purchasing practices. And these are requirements where if a government entity is going to buy something, it has to be made in the United States. For instance, we on the UT campus do not see foreign cars being driven by campus employees. The maintenance trucks that you see, the official UT cars that you see, or vans, are all typically made in the USA. Other protectionist policies include protecting what are called infant industries. This is where new industries get subsidization and protection from trade because we want that new industry to flourish. We want it to grow. All of this is part of our strategic trade with the here in the United States with other nation states. And so then we see the United States in its trade with other nation states. Our top 10 trading partners in 2014, Canada, China, Mexico. Well, Canada and Mexico, of course, are part of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so it's likely that they would be not just our neighbors, and that would lead to us having the greatest trade with them, but also because we have this free trade agreement. As we said in an earlier lecture, China has become the de facto producer or labor force for the rest of the world. And so that leads to China being our high trade partner, particularly on importing goods. Another key area of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and another key area of this sort of global trading regime, is the monetary relations among nation states. And this is what we see the International Monetary Fund doing as its job. As I mentioned earlier, U.S. primacy, our place in the world, and plus since we built the International Monetary Fund after World War II, we have this dominance in that institution. The U.S. has a 16.75 vote share in the IMF. As I said earlier, it takes 85% of the vote share in the IMF to make a major policy. So the United States maintains an effective veto in that organization. What that organization is concerned about is what other nations owe the United States, or what any nation state owes to another nation state. That is, when it comes to the level of trade, and not just the trade in goods and services going back and forth, but then the money that has to account for it, the International Monetary Fund keeps up with this, and this is what is called the balance of payments. The balance of payments is a summary record of all international economic transactions that a country has over a given period. In this case, it is 1 year. And so it keeps up with all transactions among nation states on a nation state to nation state level, and not just the volume of their trade, the value of the trade, but then how much each country owes one another. And so they observe the balance of payments, they observe the exchange rate system, and all of this is intended to allow trading to go into a sort of more efficient and effective and smoother way. They also offer financial assistance when nation states get too much in debt, and they offer technical assistance on economic issues. And so the International Monetary Fund is linked to trade by this term I have here in the middle called drawing rights. How much are you allowed to get into debt to other nation states? Well, that is based on your buy-in to the International Monetary Fund, which is based on the size of your nation state's economy. And so how much the International Monetary Fund will cover you as you owe other countries money in doing trade or business with them are your drawing rights. One of the things that we know about the International Monetary Fund in the media has to do with the term I have here at the bottom called the Structural Adjustment Programs. This is also called IMF conditionality, and in the media it's called an IMF bailout, where a nation state gets too much in debt, so much so that it can't pay back its debts to other countries. And in this case, the IMF steps in and bails out or gives money to that nation state so that it can pay off its debts. Really, it gives money not to the country that owes others, it just pays off its debts for it. And those debts then are transferred to the country owing the IMF rather than any number of countries around the world. But in order to get this, you have to go through this structural adjustment program. And I have the elements of the structural adjustment program here. That you have to cut your government spending. You have to lower the value of your currency. You have to allow for more open trade. You have to lower your tariffs. You have to get rid of those barriers to trade. All of this is in order to reduce your payments imbalances, that is the debt that you owe. And that's primarily why cutting government spending is a part of IMF structural adjustment. And so the most recent episode of this was in Greece, where the IMF and the European Central Bank transferred the debts that Greece owed to a bunch of countries to themselves. And so Greece had to pay back the IMF, which as of this date they haven't, and pay back the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, rather than pay those other nation states. But if you are familiar with that situation, you saw where pension programs had been cut, where government employees had been laid off, and it really puts a nation state's economy into a bad place. And so this idea of the structural adjustment is very unpopular. The IMF itself is very unpopular among nation states who have to rely on it. And thus this affects what the United States can do in its foreign policy, because as a builder of the IMF and as a controlling entity of the IMF, the United States then gets the blame for the economic problems that countries face when they have to go through these structural adjustment programs.